The phone rang once, and her life was never the same again. They call it the midnight call, an urban legend that's been whispered about for decades. It always happens at exactly 12 a.m. The phone rings just once, and if you're unlucky enough to answer, you become part of the legend. Because no one who answers the midnight call is ever seen again. The first recorded case was in 1987. Sarah Mitchell, a 23-year-old college student. Sarah was studying for her finals when the phone rang at midnight, just once. She almost ignored it, almost. But curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the phone. What she heard on the other end was a voice, not human, not quite animal. It spoke her name. Then it told her exactly when she was going to die. The next morning, Sarah's roommate found the apartment empty. Her bed was unmade, her books still open, her coffee was still warm, and the phone was off the hook. The police investigated for months. They found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Sarah Mitchell had simply vanished. But the story didn't end there. Over the next 5 years, 12 more people disappeared, all under identical circumstances. A single phone call at midnight, then nothing. Detective Morrison was the first to notice the pattern. Every victim had received a call at exactly midnight. Every call came from the same number, a number that didn't exist. According to the phone company, the number 000000000 had never been assigned. It was impossible. But the calls kept coming. The media caught wind of the story. They called him the Midnight Caller. But the legend was just beginning. Local folklore researcher Dr. Elena Vasquez began investigating the disappearances. What she discovered was terrifying. The Midnight Caller wasn't new. He'd been active for over a century. 1923, Margaret O'Brien disappeared after answering her phone at midnight. 1954, Robert Chen, last seen answering a late-night phone call. 1978, Lisa Rodriguez vanished without a trace. Dr. Vasquez found over 200 cases spanning 100 years, all following the exact same pattern. But she also discovered something else. The calls only came on nights when the victim was completely alone, and somehow the caller always knew. That night, Dr. Vasquez realized she was alone, and it was almost midnight. Jessica Chen was a 28-year-old graphic designer. She lived alone and often worked late into the night. October 15th, 2023. She was finishing a project when her phone rang. The display showed a number that shouldn't exist. Something told her not to answer. The phone stopped ringing. Jessica felt a wave of relief wash over her. Then it rang again. This time, something was different. She felt compelled to answer. Against every instinct, she answered. The voice on the other end was like nothing she'd ever heard. It knew things about her that no one else knew. Her childhood fears, her deepest secrets. Then the voice told her she had exactly 1 hour. 1 hour before it came for her. Jessica tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. She was trapped. 15 minutes had passed. Jessica tried calling for help, but her phone had no signal. She screamed for help from her window, but no one could hear her. Then the lights went out. Her computer began displaying messages. Messages that weren't from any program she had installed. 30 minutes left. Jessica could hear footsteps in the walls. Shadows that moved without light to cast them. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head. But the mirror showed her the truth. She wasn't alone anymore. 15 minutes remaining. The temperature in the apartment plummeted. Jessica's breath came out in frozen clouds. Then the phone rang again. This time, Jessica knew she had to answer. 1 minute until 1 a.m. Jessica walked toward the phone like a woman walking to her execution. Her hand shook as she answered. The voice that spoke was ancient, hungry, and it knew her name. It told her things about herself that she'd never told anyone. The walls began to bleed. Reality itself began to unravel. Then the clock struck 1. Jessica saw what was coming for her, a figure that shouldn't exist in our world. Jessica tried to scream, but no sound came out. The phone fell from her hand, and the line went dead. The next morning, Jessica's co-workers found her apartment empty. Not just empty. It was as if she had never existed at all. Another case for Detective Morrison's growing file. Detective Morrison had been tracking the Midnight Caller for 20 years, and he was no closer to stopping it. Detective Morrison decided to investigate the impossible number. Every phone company had the same response. The number 000000000 had never been assigned to anyone, anywhere. But somehow, calls were being made from it. A technician at the phone company told Morrison something disturbing. The calls weren't coming from anywhere on Earth. The signal was coming from coordinates that didn't exist, somewhere between our world and somewhere else. That night, Morrison decided to stake out the next potential victim, Mark Stevens. 31 years old, lived alone. Morrison parked outside Mark's house and waited. At 11:58, Morrison's radio went dead. Static filled every frequency. Then his car clock began to flicker. One by one, the streetlights went out. Morrison realized he was witnessing something impossible. Inside the house, Mark was unaware of what was coming. Midnight. Mark was watching late-night television when his phone rang. Once. Mark didn't hesitate. Morrison watched in horror as Mark answered the call. He tried to intervene, but his car wouldn't start. Through his binoculars, Morrison watched Mark's face change. First confusion, then fear. The lights in the house began to flicker. Mark dropped the phone, but the voice continued speaking. Morrison saw shapes moving past the windows. Shapes that weren't human. Then the house went completely dark. Morrison's watch stopped at 1 a.m. He forced his way out of the car and ran to the house. The house was empty. Not just empty. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. Morrison searched every room. Even the phone was gone. There was no evidence that Mark Stevens had ever existed. Morrison began to question his own sanity. The next day, Morrison searched for any record of Mark Stevens. There were none. No birth certificate, no social security number, no employment records. It was as if Mark Stevens had been erased from existence. Morrison began to wonder about all the other victims. Had they ever really existed? Or were they all just echoes of people who had been consumed by something beyond our understanding? That night, Morrison realized something that chilled him to the bone. He had been so focused on the investigation that he hadn't noticed. He was alone, completely alone, and it was almost midnight. Morrison's heart began to race. He stared at his phone. 20 years of investigating the midnight caller, and now he fit the profile perfectly. Morrison ran for the exit, but the door wouldn't open. He was trapped, just like all the others. 1 minute until midnight. Morrison walked back to his desk. He sat down and waited. The seconds ticked by like a countdown to doom. At exactly midnight, his phone rang. Once. Morrison knew what would happen if he answered, but he also knew this might be his only chance to understand. He answered the call. The voice that spoke was older than civilization itself. Morrison tried to ask questions, but the voice had only one message. The midnight caller wasn't taking people to another place. It was erasing them from existence entirely. They had never existed at all. The phone fell to the floor, and Detective Morrison was gone. No trace of his investigation remained. The midnight caller continues to hunt. Every night, somewhere in the world, a phone rings once at midnight, and someone, somewhere, is alone. Maybe it's a college student working late on an assignment, or an elderly man spending another night alone. Perhaps a businesswoman working through the night, or a night shift worker keeping watch in an empty building. The clock approaches midnight, and somewhere, a phone begins to ring. The legend says the midnight caller can reach anyone, anywhere. All it takes is answering the wrong call and becoming another person who never existed. So the next time your phone rings at midnight, remember this story. Remember that some calls should never be answered. Because once you hear that voice, once you become part of the legend, there's no going back. The midnight caller is always listening, always waiting, and he might be calling you next. Sweet dreams.